The sun slid low across the sky, dragging long golden fingers across the dust-choked plains, as if trying to hold the day in place before darkness swallowed it whole. The train howled like a wounded animal, then hissed as it slowed through the outskirts of Whitestone, its steel belly trembling. The sound scattered crows from the dead oak tree near the station, their wings slicing the quiet like knives. She stepped down slowly, one gloved hand on her belly, the other holding tight to a faded carpet bag with threadbare seams. Clara May had not expected a welcome, not flowers, not banners, but the weight of watching eyes still pressed hard against her ribs. Curtains shifted in the windows of the saloon, of the mercantile. Children stood in doorways, their bare feet silent on warped wood, their eyes round and shining with questions they would not dare ask. The wind carried grit and silence in equal measure. Clara had walked through shame before. She knew how it trailed, behind you like a second shadow, how it turned polite smiles into tight-lipped nods and sentences into whispers after you passed. But this shame, the kind that rounded your belly in a place like this, was the kind that had a name, and worse, a price. She looked to the platform's edge where he waited. Elias Monroe. He was tall, with shoulders wide as a barn door and boots, clean enough to suggest vanity or inexperience. His hat was pressed down too sharp against his brow, as though trying to hide the unease coiling beneath it. He held a bouquet of prairie lilies, already wilting at the tips. Her heart did not leap. There was no soft bloom of affection. She was not here for that. She was here for a roof, for a name to give the child stirring quietly within her, for a place where the world might stop looking at her like she was made of glass and gilt. Elias stepped forward, his jaw tense. "You're Clara?" She nodded. His eyes dropped, uninvited, to her stomach. They did not rise again. The silence widened between them like a canyon. "You didn't say nothing in your letters about that." The bouquet drooped in his hand. She didn't look at it. "I didn't think it would matter," she said. "I thought a man asking for a bride through the post might understand what it means to be alone." His face twitched. "That ain't fair." She straightened, her hand a protective shield over her belly. "I didn't come here to beg." "Good," he muttered. "Because I don't want a liar." The train heaved behind her, steam curling around her legs like it too considered staying. She turned from him. The bouquet dropped soundlessly to the ground. Whitestone was a town stitched together with caution and wind. Every building leaned a little to one side, as if unsure whether it wanted to stay. Clara walked past the saloon, past the church with its steeple leaning like an old man's back, past the silence that clung to her boots like tar. There was no room at the inn, the barkeep said with a shrug that spoke of practiced indifference. No vacancies, no beds, no bother. His eyes lingered on her belly. Another man might have offered the hayloft for a coin. He didn't. She found the old miners' quarters half a mile from the tracks, where the windows had long since been punched out by wind and rocks and boys with nothing to do. It would do. It had 4 walls, and that was more than she'd had. Yesterday, she lit no fire. There was none to light. The stars blinked awake, cold and cruel, as Clara curled around herself on the ragged cot. The child fluttered again, a soft pulse beneath her ribs. A girl, maybe. Or a boy who would grow to look like the man who had promised marriage in Missouri and vanished before the leaves turned. She didn't cry. Not because she didn't want to. Because she had long ago used up the tears she was owed. The next morning came too slow. Whitestone's sun was merciless. She washed her face in the trough behind the general store, the cold water biting. The townsfolk passed her like a ghost. A woman with a stomach like hers wasn't supposed to be seen, not without a ring or a man to trail behind. She didn't ask for work, not directly, but she began sweeping. First the general store's front step, then the alley beside it. The old shopkeeper watched her for an hour, then grunted and tossed her a coin without looking up from his ledger. "You clean, you eat," he said. Simple as that. She nodded and returned to sweeping. Dust was dust, whether in a parlor or on the ground. 3 days passed, then 4. Elias did not return, nor send word. She saw him once, riding down the center of town with 2 other men, their horses proud and clean. He did not look at her. She preferred it that way. On the 5th day, someone left a pair of worn boots by her door. Soft leather, stitched clean. They didn't fit perfectly, but they were dry. She wore them anyway. On the 6th, she noticed him, the blacksmith. He worked like the world wasn't watching. Quiet. Steady. Arms dark with soot. Face half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't stare. Didn't speak. Just nodded when she passed. Micah Stone. She'd heard his name once. Passed. Between 2 women who sold pies outside the church. Lost his wife 3 winters ago. No children. Never remarried. Talks to horses more than people. He didn't pity her. That was worth something. That night, as wind knifed through the cracks in her borrowed walls, Clara whispered to the child, "We'll be all right." It wasn't a promise. It was a prayer. She returned to the general store at dawn, her back aching. She knelt to scrub the boards beside the door. Her fingers were raw, knuckles red. She didn't notice the figure standing above her until his shadow stretched across her hands. She looked up. Micah held out a small brown parcel. No words, just calloused fingers and a quiet gaze. Inside, a loaf of fresh bread, still warm. She stared. "Why?" His voice was low, made of gravel and years. "Because you look like someone who forgot what kindness tastes like." He turned and walked off before she could answer. The wind kicked up again. It carried whispers. Maybe they weren't cruel this time. Maybe they were just curious. Clara broke the bread in half, ate 1 piece, saved the other. She went to the church that evening, not for prayer, but for silence. She sat in the back pew and listened to the creak of wood, the sigh of old timbers. The world had narrowed since she stepped off the train, but somehow the silence held space for her. Outside, the sun burned its last breath across the sky. The door creaked. She turned, expecting the preacher. It was Elias. He looked tired, meaner than before. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You shamed me," he said without ceremony. "You brought your troubles into my name." She didn't flinch. "You never gave me your name." He took a step closer. The church seemed smaller with him in it. "You think anyone here's going to take you now? Pregnant and no man beside you? That blacksmith feeding you scraps? You think that means something?" Clara stood, steady despite the ache in her spine. "I think kindness always means something." He scoffed. "You'll regret this." She watched him leave, his boots echoing loud and hollow on the wood. The stars were already out when she walked back. The wine carried the scent of iron and horses. She passed the forge. It glowed like a heart in the dark. Micah didn't look up as she passed. He didn't have to. She paused. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above breath. Still, he said nothing. Just lifted his hammer, struck metal with quiet purpose. And for the first time since she arrived in Whitestone, Clara May smiled. Not wide, not foolish, but real. The kind of smile that doesn't ask for more, just recognizes the moment for what it is, a beginning. The days in Whitestone moved like molasses in winter. slow and thick with quiet judgment. Every morning Clara rose before the sun, her body aching as if time had buried her beneath its own weight. Her belly grew with the sure rhythm of the seasons, and though her skin stretched tight, her silence stretched tighter. Each morning she swept the dust from someone else's doorstep. Each evening she returned to the forgotten miner's shack that breathed cold through every crack. No one asked where she came from anymore. They had filled in the blanks themselves. Some whispered of sin, others of abandonment, but none asked Clara, because asking might require listening. Only one man ever watched her with eyes that asked nothing. Micah Stone, blacksmith of Whitestone, stood behind the glowing mouth of his forge each day like a monument, still, smoky, quiet. His hands were always dark with ash, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his face rarely broke from its thoughtful stillness. He did not speak of her, nor for her, but somehow the space between them felt more like a conversation than anything else she'd known in months. It began in gestures, small ones, a jar of salve left on her windowsill for the cracked skin on her hands, a small stool placed near his forge one morning, far enough to not disturb, but close enough for rest. A bundle of kindling dropped outside her door, tied with twine, the knot careful and clean. Clara didn't thank him with words. She knew better than to break the quiet they shared. It was not fragile. No, it was the kind of silence that wrapped around your shoulders like a heavy quilt, warm and meant for two. She began passing by the forge more often, pretending to need this or that. A nail, a hinge, a hook for her door. Each time he offered it without charge, with only the briefest nod and that ever-present heat behind him. The forge was a heart that never stopped beating, and beside it Micah seemed like the soul of it. The town kept its eyes on them, but Clara had learned not to flinch beneath the weight of looking. The preacher's wife narrowed her eyes each time. They crossed paths, and Elias, when she saw him, which was seldom now, scowled like he had tasted something sour and couldn't spit it out. One evening Clara brought him a peach. It was small, nearly bruised through, bought with the coin she earned scrubbing the mercantile shelves. She set it on the edge of the forge without a word. Micah looked down at it, then back at her. His expression didn't shift, but his hands paused mid-motion, as if her small gift had broken a rhythm he didn't know he was keeping. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough as gravel. Not from disuse, but from something deeper. A man who'd spoken softly for so long, the words now had weight. She only nodded and stepped back into the wind. Elias returned one Sunday with liquor on his breath and a pride too big for the saddle he sat. He stood outside the church, smirking. As she passed, "Guess he's not so high and mighty now," Elias called out, loud enough for the congregation to hear. "All that hammering can't make a woman pure again." Clara didn't stop walking. The words rolled behind her like stones down a hill. "You carry a bastard and you think a blacksmith'll clean the dirt off you." The world tilted slightly. Micah's hammer struck once, twice, then silence, then bootsteps, hard and fast. Elias went quiet when he turned. Micah stood tall. Not threatening, just present, like a wall that had always been there, unnoticed until now. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Elias spat into the dirt and walked away. Micah returned to the forge without a word, but that night Clara left half her bread on his anvil. The next morning she found a rose on her doorstep. Wild, unkempt, beautiful. The days unfolded gently. Clara's stomach rounded and her steps slowed. Her strength became measured, preserved like old linens. She began spending her afternoons in the small chair near Micah's forge, sewing or peeling apples when she had them, never speaking unless necessary. Sometimes she read aloud, her voice barely above the flicker of flame. Micah would work while she read. His face never changed, but he moved in time with her cadence, the rhythm of her voice like a second hammer. Then came the storm. It rolled across the plains like a beast, all hunger and rage. Lightning lit the mountains and made the sky weep. The miner's shack had no roof strong enough for that kind of wind. Clara ran with her skirt soaked through, the rain beating her belly like fists. She knocked on the first door she reached. It was his. Micah opened it, and for the first time, his face changed. Not with shock, not with fear, but something older, something like recognition. He stepped aside, and Clara entered. The blacksmith's cabin was small but strong, warm from the forge that never cooled. The fire crackled as she stood shivering, her arms wrapped around herself like a shell. "You shouldn't be out in this," he said, fetching a blanket without waiting to be asked. "No place else?" she answered softly. He paused, holding the cloth in his hands. "Then this is your place now." The words sat between them, quiet and wild. He helped her into the chair, wrapped her in warmth, then crouched to remove her wet boots with a gentleness she hadn't expected from calloused hands. Her eyes met his. There was nothing rushed, nothing eager, just presence, the kind of care that asked nothing and offered everything. "You'll stay here until the storm's done," he said, standing slowly, "you and the child." She blinked at that. The first time he had named it. A child, not a burden, not a mistake. The storm pounded against the walls, but it was far away now. She fell asleep to the sound of his hammer, soft against the anvil like a lullaby. Days passed, then weeks. She didn't return to the miner's shack. No one questioned it. The town watched, yes, but said little, perhaps because they feared Micah, or perhaps because the silence between him and Clara was louder than any words they could hurl. Elias came again. He stood at the edge of the forge, arms crossed, face twisted like old wood. "You think this makes her yours?" he sneered. Micah didn't look up, just worked the iron, shaping a horseshoe as if it were a crown. "She's not something to be owned." Elias stepped forward, spitting the words. "She fooled you. That belly's full of another man's shame." Micah placed the horseshoe gently aside. "Then I suppose it's my honor to carry it." Clara, watching from the shadows, felt something break inside. Not her heart, something older, something wounded and hidden for too long. She stepped out beside him. Elias opened his mouth, but she spoke first. "I didn't ask for your protection. I asked for your respect. You gave me neither." Elias stared at her belly, at Micah, then at the horseshoe cooling in the firelight. He said nothing, just turned and left, his pride trailing like smoke behind him. That night, Clara sat with Micah beneath the stars, her hands folded across her belly, his resting on his knees. "You didn't ask why," she said after a long silence. "About the baby. About why I came here. Why I lied." He looked up. "Didn't matter. You're here now." She nodded slowly, tears stinging but not falling. "Do you think it's wrong? To start again? Even like this?" He turned his face to the stars. "I think most good things begin with a little broken." She reached over and took his hand. Not out of need, out of knowing, and in that quiet moment, with the fire behind them and the world holding its breath, it felt, just barely, like home. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the night a coyote howled, but Clara didn't flinch, because beside her was a man who had watched without asking. And now, he was listening. Spring came slowly to Whitestone, as though the land itself had to be convinced that gentleness could follow so much cold. The snow melted first on the roof of the blacksmith's cabin, trickling down the edges like tears too long held. Then came The buds, small, stubborn things poking through the thawing earth like promises whispered before they were believed. Clara felt it in her bones before she saw it, the stillness of winter giving way to the rhythm of new life. Her belly, now vast and aching, made every movement careful. Each breath carried weight. Each night she lay curled under Micah's quilt, listening to the forge sighing in its sleep, the soft snore of the man who shared her silence. Not her bed, not yet, but her silence. There was a rhythm to their days now. She would rise first, moving slow but steady, heating coffee over the iron stove while Micah stirred from the loft. He spoke more, but only when the words had roots. Nothing wasted, nothing hollow. Sometimes in the still afternoon, he would sit with her beneath the willow tree out back, the one just beginning to bloom. She would press his hand to her stomach, and he'd wait, motionless, until he felt the child stir. He never spoke of fatherhood. He never claimed it. But when the baby kicked, his eyes softened like steel tempered in water. The town still watched. Mrs. Hollis from the church kept her gossip sharp as shears. The general store boys whispered louder. Now, Elias was gone more often than not, but sometimes he rode through town like a ghost not yet willing to admit he'd died. But Clara had stopped living in the town's shadow. She was building her own light now, one slow moment at a time. Then came the letter. It arrived with the dry wind of early April, tucked in with the supplies from Carson's outpost, addressed only to Clara W., in a hand she hadn't seen in nearly a year. She opened it on the porch, her hands trembling not from fear, but memory. The words were neat, clean, cold. Her father. He'd written from Kansas, where news traveled slow, but judgment traveled fast. He had heard, from someone, from somewhere, about her condition, about her disgrace. There was no mention of a daughter, only of shame, only of endings. Do not come home, he wrote. There is no place for you here. She read it once, twice, then folded it carefully and burned it in Micah's forge. He watched her, but didn't ask. He only handed her a rag for the tears she hadn't noticed falling. That night she asked if he would sit with her, not beside the fire, beside her bed. He did. She did not speak. She only placed his calloused hand against her bare stomach, where the baby now pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. It's close, she whispered. Micah nodded. I'll be here. The birth came on the first thunderstorm of spring. Rain lashed, the cabin like judgment, but the walls held. Micah moved like a man twice himself, steady, sure, unflinching. He boiled water. He held her hand. He knelt beside the midwife, offering only what was asked, nothing more. Clara screamed once, a sound that tore through the walls of the cabin and echoed into the valley. But then the storm passed, inside and out. A girl, small, red, wailing, perfect. Clara held her with hands that had scrubbed floors and packed suitcases, hands that had written letters no one answered. Her arms were tired, her body split, but her heart was full. Micah stood at a distance. She looked up, her voice weak. You want to hold her? He didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, hands shaking for the first time since she'd known him. She placed the child into his arms. He looked down, eyes wet, expression unreadable. She needs a name, Clara whispered. He looked up. You choose. Clara smiled. Hope. He nodded once, as if the name had always been waiting. The days after were a blur of swaddling cloth and soft cries. Clara moved slower now, stitched and sore, but no longer alone. Micah held the child each night, humming low tunes from nowhere, not songs, but sounds that comforted like lullabies passed from the bones. Word spread. Some said the baby wasn't his, others said she might as well be, but no one questioned it aloud. Not after the day Elias returned. He came just before dusk, riding into town like a storm that refused to fade. His boots hit the ground with purpose. He walked straight to the forge. Clara watched from the window, heart in her throat. Micah stood waiting, hammer in hand. You took what wasn't yours. Elias spat. Micah turned, calm. She was never yours. Elias sneered. You think a child makes her clean? She's just play-acting peace. She'll leave you too once she's rested. Micah's jaw set, his silence deeper than rage. Clara stepped outside. The baby was in her arms, swaddled in the quilt Micah had stitched from old shirts. She faced Elias, chose to stay. Her voice was quiet, but it held the weight of all the years he'd ignored her words. You left when I needed someone. Now you want to be needed. Elias looked at the child, then back at her. You're nothing but... Clara stepped closer. Don't. Finish that, Elias, because I know who I am now, and it's not yours to name. Micah moved behind her, quiet as always. Elias met his eyes, but found no opening. He left without another word. This time it felt final. The town changed in the way towns do, not with fanfare, but with slow forgetting. The scandal dulled, the whispers quieted. Clara became not the girl who'd arrived alone, but the woman who stayed, who built, who mothered. Micah and Clara never declared anything. There was no wedding, no vows spoken over altars or fields, but they were a family all the same. Hope grew, and with her, laughter returned to the cabin. Clara sang again, softly, but with truth. Micah began carving toys, little horses and spoons, things shaped with care. One evening, as the firelight danced on the walls, Clara asked, "Why didn't you ever ask what happened?" Micah stirred the coals with a long iron rod, because I could see what mattered. That you were here, that you stayed. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I didn't think anyone would want me. Not really. Not like this. He turned to her, his voice low. Then they never knew what they were missing. She closed her eyes. Hope stirred in her crib, cooing like spring itself. The room was quiet, but not empty. Outside, the willow tree blossomed. Inside, love bloomed like something once buried too deep to reach, but not anymore. And far away, beyond the town and the gossip and the years that tried to break her, Clara finally felt what she'd been searching for all along. Not forgiveness, but peace. The kind that didn't ask questions, the kind that simply stayed. The wind changed in late summer. It came warmer from the south, carrying the scent of hay and iron and something else. An ache, perhaps, one that whispered through the tall grasses and stirred the branches of the willow tree behind the forge. Whitestone lay still under its golden sun, but something inside the town had shifted. Like the wind had blown open a door no one remembered closing. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, the child pressed to her chest. Hope was heavier now, fuller in the limbs, brighter in the eyes. She had her mother's quiet and something else, a gaze like sky-watched steel, the kind that saw things before they happened. Clara often thought she'd been born knowing sorrow, but the baby had come into the world knowing stillness. Micah was at the forge, as always, but not like before. His hammer moved slower now, not from weakness, but because he was crafting something, finer than hinges or plows. It was a tiny horseshoe small as a palm, useless for riding, but Clara knew. It was for Hope. She hadn't asked him for it, she never had to. That was what set Micah apart from the rest. He didn't need permission to care. He didn't seek reward. He simply loved the way a man loved a sunrise he never expected to see again. Some nights, Clara would wake to the sound of his boots softly moving across the floor. Not leaving, never leaving, just pacing gently, singing to hope in his low, cracked hum, wrapped in a quilt with her against his chest. It broke something in Clara, not because she was sad, but because she'd never known this kind of safety could exist. There were things Micah never said, but Clara had learned to hear them anyway, in the way he made breakfast without asking how. She took her eggs, in the way he sanded down the edge of the cradle when hope began to roll, in the way he waited for her to decide what they were, never pushing, never pulling, just there. And then, one morning, the past came riding back. Into town, a letter, this time from Elias. It arrived in a bag of oats delivered by a traveler who didn't know the sender, only the name scribbled across the envelope. Clara Whitestone. Not Clara Winters. Not Clara anything else. Just Clara, as though the name had finally grown into her. She read it under the willow tree. He had married a woman from his father's church. She could not bear children. He wrote it plainly, like a weather report. He said he'd been thinking of hope, that perhaps, under God's will, the child might still be claimed, as if she were livestock, as if a womb meant ownership. Clara's fingers gripped the page until the creases ran like scars. Her first thought was not fear, but fury. And then, fear followed. Micah found her before the letter hit the earth. She didn't speak, just handed him the page. He read it, slowly, quietly, then folded it, hands steady. He looked at her, not with panic, but with something heavier. "Are you scared?" he asked. She wanted to say no, but she nodded, only a little. He nodded too. "Then I'll be scared with you." That night, the wind rose again. It howled through the cracks in the shutters. The fire roared against it. And inside, Clara felt something gather inside Micah. Not rage, but resolve. He cleaned the rifle he hadn't touched in a year, oiled it slow, laid it across the table, not as a threat, but a promise. Hope slept beside the fire. Micah sat beside her. Clara sat beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The next morning, the town was buzzing. Elias had arrived, with a lawyer and a sheriff from a neighboring county, one Clara had never known. The papers he carried were clean and cruel: custody demands, questions of paternity, assertions of blood. Micah stood beside Clara as she listened, her body still and upright, hope swaddled in her arms. Her voice was calm when she spoke. "You left." Elias shifted. "I was afraid." Clara blinked. "And now you're brave?" He stepped forward, eyes flickering. "She's mine. By law." Micah's voice came then, not loud, not angry, just true. "She is not a possession." Elias turned to him, sneering. "You think standing here makes you her father?" Micah looked at Clara. "No," he said, but staying did. The room fell into silence. Even the lawyer shifted awkwardly. Elias spoke again, softer now. "She's blood." Clara stepped forward. "So am I." Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. "I carried her. I bled for her. I woke up every hour to keep her warm. I held her through the fever. I sang when my voice cracked. I stayed." She looked to Micah. He stayed. "She's his in every way that matters." Then she turned to the sheriff. "Do you know what it means to be a father out here?" The sheriff looked down, then nodded, slow. "I do, ma'am." Then Elias spoke again, but not to her. He looked to Micah. "You love her?" Micah didn't flinch. "Yes." "You love the child?" Micah's jaw tightened. "With my life." Elias stood quiet a long time, then folded the papers and walked out without another word. He didn't come back. Clara stood in the doorway long after he disappeared down the road, the dust still swirling in the wind. She held Hope tight. Micah stood beside her. She turned to, him. "You didn't have to do that." He met her eyes. "I did." She reached for his hand, and for the first time she didn't let go. Time softened after that. Not like forgetting, but like forgiveness. Hope grew into a little girl with questions, a laugh like birdsong, and eyes that missed nothing. She called Micah Papa one morning while chasing a butterfly. He dropped his hammer when she said it, didn't speak for a full hour after. But when she said it again, he smiled. Clara watched them from the porch, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea. Her heart beat slow and full. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she thought of the letter, of the man she thought she'd love, of the father who turned his back. But the ache no longer ruled her, because she had a child who loved fearlessly, and a man who stood without asking to be thanked, and a life that had come not from wishes, but from work, from truth, from the kind of love that whispered instead of shouted. One night she sat by the fire, pen in hand. She began to write a letter, not to her father, not to Elias, to the girl she used to be. She wrote, "You were never ruined. You were never too much. You were only waiting to be seen by someone who knew how to look." She folded the page, pressed it into the journal where she kept Hope's drawings. Micah came in from the cold, dusted with ash and stars. She stood, walked to him, and pressed her face to his chest. "I love you," she said. He whispered into her hair, "I know." And outside the stars flickered like candles in a church no one had named. And inside, a father held his child, a woman held her truth, and the fire never went out. If you felt something in your chest, even just a flicker, leave a mark for others to find. A like, a comment, a memory you carry. Tell me where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to know. Love doesn't come easy, but when it stays for good.